इंसान परेशान सुनने वाला बेईमान इंसान परेशान फिर भी चालू है.
Hi Jayesh, welcome back in conversation. So today let's focus on your entrepreneurial journey, your mindset, and what your enablers perhaps were in that journey. Sounds good?
Excellent. I'm looking forward to it, and thank you for coming back.
Awesome, great. So let's begin. If you could give us some context as to how you grew up, and what I'd be interested in understanding is the role that your parents played, perhaps in shaping how you think.
Sure. I had the good fortune of having very good education. So I went to St. Lawrence High School in Calcutta.
Mm-hmm.
I grew up in Bhawanipur, and St. Lawrence actually is a school which is in the top 2 or 3 schools in Calcutta, but they do not have Gujarati as a language.
Mm-hmm.
So this is one of the things that I had to do at home. So I learned Gujarati at home,
Yeah.
but I studied Bengali in school.
Yeah.
So I can read, write, speak Bengali. So that was one good benefit of it. So growing up, my parents, father was a businessman, so he was very busy, and my mother was a homemaker, so she looked after us. And the personalities were totally different. So my father is a very hopeful, optimist, positive person, sees good in everything and anything. And so that's rubbed off on me in a very good way.
Okay.
And my mother was more of a personality where she would be critical of my father being so generous with everyone and everything.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So every so often she would say that you're not looking after yourselves and us. Right? So there was an influence of that on me, because ultimately my father did not end up doing well in his business and retired at the age of 50, and just decided that this was not his cup of tea.
Yeah.
But he actually spent a lot of time in community service. So one of the big things that he did was that there is a Gujarati Sahitya Mandal, so the language literature of Gujarati.
Yeah.
He promoted that a lot.
Okay.
So I grew up in that influence of giving back, being positive and hopeful and optimist. But on the other side, my mom was very religious and wanted us to be careful, and especially my father to be careful. Now, my father's influence also was to an extent where he gave the freedom. He gave us the freedom, and I saw that he was giving us so much leeway. You could construe it 2 ways, right? Some people can say that he's ignoring and he doesn't have time for you, but some of them are conscious decisions to say that, okay, what do you want to do at this point in time?
Yeah.
And so when you're at a crossroad, marching orders would usually be given from a father to a son. Instead, he would pause and say, what is it that you'd like to do? Then he would debate with me, bring me to people who are smarter than us and say, what do you think? He wants to do this, so that make sure that I get that bouncing board effect.
Yeah.
So that's how the early years were.
Yeah. Okay. So you feel like you were aligned with your parents, with your dad in this journey. So it wasn't so much of a resistance and a struggle to explore what you wanted.
Not at all. I think every crossroad where I had a very big decision to make, they allowed me to do what I wanted to do.
Yeah.
Which now, when I look at it, hindsight, there's a word that we use, allowed. Whereas in our kids' generation now, my kids, there is no question of allowed. They do what they want to do.
Yeah.
Once they become an adult and they are mature and making decisions of their own. So it's a different Western culture and an Eastern culture.
And this perhaps showed up, as you chose to quit and drop out of both IIT and IIM.
Yeah, so that was quite interesting. I had no clue why I wanted to do electrical engineering, but I did want to do engineering. I think logical, rational, intellectually stimulating. But I didn't have a really, really good idea why I wanted to do electrical engineering. So when I appeared for my IIT joint entrance exam, I got a 900 rank, and all they offered me was metallurgy in Kharagpur and civil in Powai, in IIT Powai.
Yeah.
And so I took Kharagpur, metallurgy, but a lot of friends told me that if you really want to do electrical engineering, you can switch over. But then when I got into MS University, Baroda, in electrical engineering, I think the allure of the place and away from home, Kharagpur is still in West Bengal, but the allure of going away to Gujarat, right? As a Gujarati, I had never lived in Gujarat. So that was very attractive. And then the other thing that was attractive was just the openness and the personality, the attitude of the place, the dorms, the food, the people that I was meeting there compared to the people who were in West Bengal.
Yeah.
There was this huge uphill battle for me to say that, oh my God, I'm going to disappoint my parents. Right? My dad was definitely disappointed that I wouldn't go to IIT.
Yeah.
And especially because the business was not doing so well. If the business was doing well, he would have said, well, it doesn't matter what you study. You're going to come back and join my business.
Yeah.
But now in his back of his mind, he recognized and realized that if I was going to go to IIT and then graduate and then go to work for someone, I would do extremely well as a professional. That was in his mind. But, when I insisted that I wanted to go to Baroda, I ended up in Baroda.
Yeah.
So that was sort of the first time. Then at the end of graduating from Baroda, I applied to schools in colleges in USA, and I applied to the IIM's Joint Entrance Examination. So I did get into a few universities in US, but unfortunately my father said that I don't have the money to send you there. Maybe you can figure it out with your brother. My brother was already living in USA. But I got into IIM Bangalore first, and that was a phenomenal joy.
Yeah.
And then the next day I got admission in IIM Calcutta. And some of my friends also said that, wow, if tomorrow the letter comes from Ahmedabad, then we're all going to come together and give you a massive party, which never happened. So I never got a party from my friends in Baroda. But then I chose IIM Calcutta and paid the deposit for that. And at that point in time, came to a conclusion that fine, this is what my life is going to be like, because recognize that we didn't back then go through undergraduate, then go to work for someone for a few years, then you come back, you're mature, and then you go to MBA school. Whereas for me, just straight away from engineering going into IIM Calcutta, I had fun because of the pride of everybody thinking that I was in IIM Calcutta. The campus of Joka was fantastic. The people I was around was superb. Food was reasonable. I was going back and forth to my house over the weekend every so often, and I continued to maintain my friends in Calcutta. But it didn't do that much to me. I mean, the whole concept of behavioral, organizational behavior, and a lot of this accounting stuff and things like that, it didn't really stimulate me, appeal to me as much. I mean, I was still an engineering student. Had I done that 2 or 3 year stint
at working
professional work, and then come back to IIM Calcutta, maybe I would have enjoyed it a lot more. So that's one part of it. The other part of it is that I, of course, was disappointed that I couldn't go to US immediately after graduating. But when that opportunity came back again, when my brother sent me the I-20 and said, go apply for your visa, I did. I got my admission. I got my visa. At that point in time, I really felt that adventure was that point in time in my life, I wanted adventure. Right? I had no clue what to expect, but I knew that I had that gumption inside me that I said, I'm going to just go out there and make a life out of that. There was a lot of discussion about the amount of money you make when you come out of IIM Calcutta. It was ridiculous. And at that point in time, there was one person who came out of IIM Calcutta whose salary was 1,32,000. So that's 132,000 rupees per year, which was a massive number at that point in time. And for people thought that, oh my God, you're going to walk away from this lakhs of rupees of salary. But adventure. I think the key was adventure, that I just felt I'd just get out of India and get out of Calcutta, and I'd just go out there, have an adventure, no clue what to expect.
And your parents were, as you said, at that time they were
also disappointed.
They were
right?
disappointed.
I mean, they were disappointed from the point of view that, again, they felt that even more so than IIT, here was like a defining moment in a professional's life, and people, most of them would not have cared as much that I went to MS University if I were in Calcutta. But of course, if I had done IIT and IIM, that would have been the ultimate sort of golden platter, which I'm not going to have. And now on top of it, I'm going to leave a firm, secure, professional life to go seek adventure without knowing where it's going to land me.
So how does this work? When you described a scenario where perhaps there wasn't so much of financial backing, and then you had these opportunities in front of you and this sense of wanting that adventure, when do you make sense of this, to say that is this a whim, or am I I really need to do this for myself? How did you think about it?
It has something to do with risk-taking ability. All right. So, as I went through life, I can describe to you 3 or 4 inflection points where I could have taken the less insecure path,
Yeah.
right, been more secure, but as a risk-taking ability that I have, thanks to my parents and my father and grandfather and everyone in my generations were always a business person and risk-taking people, and so that DNA was already in me. So I'm that way blessed that it's a DNA, which is very difficult to cultivate. Everyone has a risk-taking ability chart, and you have to know what your chart is and where you are. You
Yeah.
can't do unnatural things, right? Some people don't have it, and then they become entrepreneurs, and then when on 30th they have to pay salaries, and you get heartburns. But you have to have that risk-taking ability. And so for me, that risk-taking ability brought me over the hump that said, okay, I did not have a lot of money growing up, but then when I came to the IIM Calcutta, I could have secured myself.
Correct.
But I gave that up because I got sense a much bigger adventure, and therefore took the risk. And when I say adventure, it was not just a frivolous adventure. It was an adventure that said, okay, I'm going to learn a lot, learn different things, learn different techniques that will give me the job skills and potentially get a better job and lifestyle more than anything,
Yeah.
right? So that lifestyle which I saw in Calcutta or in Kharagpur or in Joka,
Yeah.
right? But understand those places.
Yeah.
And I went to Baroda, of course, came back.
Correct.
But what I saw around me in the greater Calcutta area, that is not the life that I really, found a lot of joy from within
Yeah.
to say, wow, this is what I want to live.
So there was some level of evaluation that took place, and it was also perhaps an understanding of where you saw your life, some sort of a vision towards.
I'd
you
be
wanted.
lying if I said that I actually saw through the whole thing, how
Yeah.
it will pan out.
Yes. Yeah.
I think really the most important thing was, I had never sat on a plane till then. So here it is, I was going to get on a plane and I was going to go overseas.
Yeah.
I was going to America.
Yeah.
It is a phenomenal at that point in time. For now, a lot of youngsters get on a plane and go to different countries.
Yeah.
In our days back then, we didn't have that opportunity to get on a plane and just go to America. Had I gone to America for a holiday and then I had made a decision, that would have been more well thought through.
Yeah.
So this was not well thought through. The only hope and aspiration was that there was something better on the other side. But just the fact that I was going to go to America and
Yeah.
I landed there, it was a euphoria moment for me.
Did you at any point, in the early days, years even, regret it, or was there a sense of perhaps I didn't do the right thing?
Never. There was never a question of did I do the right thing. The question was, how am I going to survive? I didn't have money to pay fees. I didn't have money to pay my rent. I didn't have money to buy my car. Everybody needs a car in Austin, Texas, because that's, public transportation is very sketchy. So the two things that went through the mind was, how will I go through the education system, which is new, and wiggle my way through and make sure I get good grades and study and get some learning, A, and B, how am I going to economically survive? Because the third piece, which is making friends and relationship, that came to me naturally. That was sort of in my DNA. So I made tons of friends, and I moved apartment complexes. I switched roommates. I did all of those things that people do in grad school.
Right.
And so I did all of that. But the biggest challenge was the economic survival.
And how did you think through that? How did you make that happen for yourself?
Oh, again, I struggled through it. In the first semester was the most difficult, but post that I got a research assistantship. And when you get a research assistantship, your fee drops down from an international fee of $40 an hour to a Texas resident $4 an hour. And so, you pay a couple $100 fees per semester. And in your research assistantship, you get a stipend, which takes care of the fees, takes care of your food, rent, everything at that point in time.
So it was always about just figuring out how to move forward from where you were. I think
Correct.
there was never this sense of what did I lose out, what was the opportunity cost of doing what you're doing.
No, I didn't have time. I was there. It was done deal. I wanted to come here. I was enjoying the whole different seasons, different types of people, the education system, right? So I remember distinctly Dr. Herb Woodson, first course of his that I took at the University of Texas at Austin. And the first test that happened, and graduate school is very small. In these are not massive MBA classes with 400 people in a class. There must have been maybe 10, 15 people in the class. And then he gave us 3 problems to solve on the board. And then he sat down there just doing his own thing. He wasn't even looking what we were doing. Typically I was used to people walking the aisles and trying to make sure that, you're not doing anything, looking here, looking there, and doing all those things. And then a little later, I was just trying to do my things, and I was looking at people around me, and they all had their books open. And I was thinking, my God, the professor is sitting over there, and these guys are all cheating from their book and all that. And after a few minutes, he figured out what was going on. He came up to me and said, by the way, this is an open test. So I didn't, open test, I asked him. So what is open test means you're allowed to use your books.
Yeah.
I was looking at it, because seen my face, and he was like so shocked that I hadn't figured that out till then, that there is a concept of open test. So anyway, I went through that, and I did extremely well post all of this, because when the education system is so different that it is more applied, more understanding, not as much memory, replication. So I think that helped me a lot also. But again, coming back to the hardship of the economic, trying to break even and trying to make sure you can pay your bills. I think once I got my research assistantship, from that point onwards forward, I never looked back on how am I going to survive, because whatever I got, I made good from that, versus when you have to borrow money and live off that, versus now I'm not borrowing anymore, but I have to just do with whatever I'm getting per month.
Okay.
Which was not a tough problem for somebody like me.
So you're saying that cutting down on the expenditure and not having to worry
for
about
me, it was not cutting down. It was saying this is all I have, so it was not
yeah.
cutting down.
Correct.
It was saying, okay, I just allocate that budget, saying X amount of I need to pay for fees, and the rest of it I have got available. And all that means is how many times am I going to go to the grocery store? How many times am I going to eat out with my friends, right?
Yeah.
And how much am I going to spend on entertainment?
Yeah.
It was very easy for me.
And one has to be wanting and willing to do this, because this comes with its own trade-offs, whether you look at it as a trade-off or not. And perhaps in this case, it wasn't such a big deal to let go of some of these things. So I think this brings into perspective the kind of stuff it requires, if you want to take the kind of risk that you perhaps did. And fast forward, I know you did, in terms of your journey, moving into Singapore with IBM and then switching to the entrepreneurial journey. Talk to me about what the risks, and as you see it, the risks looked like in both those journeys. Yeah.
So, IBM was the first time, as I had mentioned the last time to you, IBM is the first time when I started getting a paycheck which was reasonably significant for me at that time, where we bought our first house in Houston as well, right? And with a massive mortgage. But I was sailing through that. I was getting good promotions and I was getting good bonuses and stuff like that in IBM. And then our first kid was born, Freya was born. And so we were merrily, happily living our life, and that would have been a great journey just to continue with that. And I might have been shipped here and there from Houston. I might have had to go to Dallas or maybe New York, where the IBM headquarters are. But then I got this one phone call from Dan Gupta, who said, we are starting IBM India, and would you like to come and help us? And that was the defining moment, because I was in mainstream in the oil sector. Chevron was my customer. Had a fantastic job and a fantastic job is what? It's one, are you getting paid well? Two, what you're working on, is that good fun? And three, have you figured out the job? That means figured out how to hang on to your job, how to prosper in your job, how to manage your manager. Are you enjoying what you're doing? So I had figured that out. So I was really sailing in a way. I didn't have to kind of get up in the middle of the night and worry that, am I going to be able to keep this job? And back then IBM was full 100% employer. So nobody ever got fired back then. Fired, yes, but nobody got laid off. So when that telephone call came, we had to take really a hard look at the opportunity and the option. And the option was to come to Singapore. Which was the first question I said is that I'm not interested in it because I've never worked in India and so I don't want to move to India. But Dan said, actually it's in a place called Singapore. So actually I went back home and opened the map, and Mona had been to Singapore on a cruise back in those days. And so she had glimpses of what Singapore was. I had no clue. I didn't even know where Singapore was, to be very honest, back then. And then they said that you'd get a look-see trip. So I didn't know what that meant. That meant two of us you jump on a plane and you go there and spend a week and you come back and you say, oh, I don't want it, I don't like it.
Yeah.
That's okay. Nobody says anything to you. Or you say, yep, I'll do it. This is terrific. I'll take it. And so we came on a look-see trip. We came through India. We routed ourselves through India so that we could drop Freya off to Mona's mother's place in Bombay, and then came here, spent a week, went back to Bombay, picked Freya up, and went back to Houston and said, yep, okay, we'll do it.
Okay.
And also as an expatriate, which I didn't know what it meant. So then they explained to me what it meant to be an expatriate, and that's how. So the point is, in IBM, to do something like this again takes a certain amount of risk-taking ability of adventure. Why? Because if you're in mainstream IBM role, you can go up the rank and you're within sight. When you get out and do an international assignment like this, and then try to come back after 2 years, so mine was a 2-year assignment, and then when you come back, it's fine, but that 2 became 3, became 4, became 4.5. 5 years later, it's out of sight, out of mind. So when you try to come back, now the entire momentum has happened. People have significant machinery has moved forward. Right? People have gotten promoted. People are up there in managerial level. Now you're coming back, and you got to now start climbing that. So that was the risk.
Yeah.
But I knew IBM enough. I knew my capability at IBM. I knew how I developed. IBM has the best marketing school, which was in Chaparral Creek in Dallas, Texas. And that 1 year that we spent between Dallas and Houston was again a lot more advantageous, and I learned a lot more practical application things than I did in all my education that I had in undergrad and grad, frankly.
Awesome. And then, so that was, you guys were in Singapore for a few years,
So
4.5 years you mentioned.
So 4.5 years later, IBM physically, we did so well that IBM physically moved to Bangalore and established a camp there. And they asked me to go as an expatriate to Bangalore.
Right.
And so 2 kids later, living in Singapore, lifestyle and all of that, I had never worked in India, as I mentioned, but we had never lived in Bangalore. And this is 1993 vintage of Bangalore. So we didn't really know what to expect. Whereas if today that same opportunity came and an expatriate, the packages are really superb, I might have gone. Then they said, go back to Houston, and we didn't want to go back. I mean, we were so close to India, her parents, my parents, and the lifestyle here, the Eastern lifestyle, and this has East and West, both cultures mixed together. So at that point in time, it was 12.5 years into IBM, 8 years in Houston, 4.5 years here in Singapore, and 12.5 years later, I called it quits and said, yep, I'm done with IBM, now what to do?
And you mentioned the forced entrepreneurship in a way that happened, and that journey, talk to me about that, because I know you did a bunch of things then, and then something clicked.
Yes.
So what does that look like?
So first of all, I remember the day when I finally got that phone call. I was in Amsterdam with some friends of ours, and that final call came. So listen, this is your, decision-making moment, because we don't have a job for you in Singapore. So you have to make that decision. This job in Singapore of offshore operation is done. So you're basically asked to go back to Houston. And I made that decision on the spot to say that, nope, I'm not going to go back to IBM USA. So I will, part ways. And there was a way to part ways, because if you quit, then some things you don't get. Whereas if you are, parting ways smoothly, then you get some things. So there was a little bit of insurance that came with it when I quit IBM, because I had stock options plans, and I had a, bunch of voluntary retirement kind of a package that I got. And with that, I flipped over, and my first business I started was with my systems engineer partner in IBM, who was from IBM Australia, and I had come from IBM USA. We both were together here, and so Balwant Singh and I, we started Frontier Technologies. That's the first company that we started. Again, the idea behind that was also, that's all we knew was technical sales. So selling products and services. So I had a friend in Houston who had a software product. So I called him and I said, hey, I want to sell your product here in Asia. He said, I've got nobody in Asia. You guys can have that. And you sell the software product in Asia. There was a hardware guy here who was ex-IBMer who used to like Balwant Singh a lot. And so he said, yeah, you can take my product, and I don't have any feet on street. You guys can sell it. So a few products we put together, and we had a free office at a friend's office in Singapore. He said, hey, I'm using one cabin. My other cabin is empty. You guys can use it. So there was one desk. I sat on one side, Balwant sat on the other side, one telephone. And we used to make phone calls, and we used to start selling. So that's how the entrepreneur journey started. Extremely rough. We just completely took like hardly enough money to even live at that point in time.
So what did this look like? I can imagine it was a decision made by the family, And you're saying both the kids were at the time, they were how old? Were
Correct. So they, so 1993 they were both in American school, and so international school.
Yeah.
And so we obviously the bill started coming to me.
Yeah.
And so the first thing we did is we got them off that. Then the expat rental place near Orchard Road, that went away.
Yeah.
So we went into an apartment which was slightly humble
Yeah.
compared to the Orchard Road
Yeah.
glam. And both the kids came out of school and went to local schools.
Yeah.
So I mean, we made all those adjustments with the decision that we're going to make this work.
Right. And okay. And then so how long was this?
So 93 Frontier Technologies started,
Right.
and then in 94 I got invited by my friend who said that I'm going to start a television channel, and why don't you come and help us? So I asked Balwant, I said, hey, listen, I'm being asked to do this. He said, that's fine, as long as you keep one foot here and one foot there.
Okay.
Don't sort of go away completely, because I was a majority shareholder of Frontier Technologies anyway. So he said, you're a majority shareholder, you can do whatever you want.
So that was the first startup.
The Frontier, the first startup with Balwant. So he and I had a chat to say, hey, I'm being invited to go and do this thing.
Right.
What do you think? And he said, look, you're the majority shareholder anyway, but absolutely go do that thing, but don't give up on Frontier. So Mona was already at Frontier then, so the three of us were running the business.
Yeah.
So Balwant and Mona would run that full time. I would run it because that whole initial television business plans and a lot of the meetings and everything used to have it in my office only.
Yeah.
So that way I was in the office and going in and out. And so that's how the second venture got started, which at that point in time we used to call it Ace TV.
Okay.
And so we were a bunch of friends who came together, and then one friend brought another friend, and that's how 7 of us came together, who were Indian partners trying to start a Hindi television cable and satellite channel.
Yeah.
Back then it was going to be called Ace TV.
So your first and second startup both took off.
So first one took off, and at some point in time there is a third startup happened in between in there, which is a software company out of Ahmedabad. And so when we got that going, then Frontier and that company in Ahmedabad, because we were the marketing front, right? So we started developing a relationship, and that software company bought Frontier out.
Okay.
Right? And so we continued to work, but now we were working as in Balwant and Mona, and they were working for the Ahmedabad software company.
Right.
And who was also a friend of mine from Austin.
Okay.
So we were basically on our way. And so Frontier merged into this software company, and Sony then came to us
Right.
and started having a discussion with us in terms of, hey, what are you guys doing? And we said, we're starting this cable and satellite television channel. I think the interesting thing was that they were looking for a serious big partner. So they went and spoke to a few people in India who would be their joint venture partners. But fortunately, what happens is that the most big industrial families, they want 51% equity. So Sony would have wanted a majority. The Indian company wants majority. Joint venture is very difficult. Whereas we were okay with a 60-40 split, where they took 60%, we took 40%. And so that's how the joint venture happened. And the Ace TV got renamed as Sony Entertainment Television.
So how many years was it until Sony happened?
1
Time you
year.
began?
So 94, we started working on it.
Okay.
And 95 summer, we signed the agreement. And 8th October 1995, we pushed the button where the uplink happened from Singapore. And the TV channel is still live now.
Yeah, yeah. So in terms of the struggle, in a way that one would look at it, when you started out and you mentioned a few changes had to be I'm assuming quite a few changes, lifestyle changes were made. How did you guys think about that decision, and how do you know what price shall be paid in order to explore, take this risk, not knowing what's going to happen?
Yeah, so entrepreneurial journey is not like that, right? If you sit down to take a calculated risk, there are 3 types. One is a calculated risk which is secure. One is the calculated risk which with a hope, and third is the calculated risk with no clue where it's going to go. And typically that's where we were. So we continued to plow ahead, and we got a little bit of cash flow coming, but it was really until year 2000 when we sold a little bit of our equity in Sony, all of us together, that a first reasonable serious chunk of money came to us. So from 1993 to 2000,
Okay.
was a struggle, which was sort of in the middle tier. It was a calculated struggle because you knew that if this TV channel worked, then it was going to be a massive windfall.
Yeah.
But when we got started in 93 and 94,
Yeah.
and even 95, we had no clue. And then even after we started, there were a few channels that
Correct.
lost out. So, yeah, so I think that journey was the serious, difficult, was about 4-5 years.
And you mentioned that that's not how the entrepreneurial journey plays out. There isn't a lot of surety, knowing, and uncertainties there. But having said that, like, what was the thought process? Was it just that I'm going to make this happen and go as far as it's going to take me? And how do you make sense of it when the family is involved? Is there any sense of, is everyone paying a price? Am I doing this
Yeah.
because I want to do this? You know,
Yeah.
and this is again for people who are on this journey.
No, I understand. And I think that's really very tricky. I have many friends who says that we love our kids too much, right? Making it sound like we entrepreneurs who make sacrifices and our kids make sacrifices for the family don't love our kids as much. But I think that therein lies the resilience.
Yeah.
Resilience of the entrepreneur, resilience of the kids, resilience of the spouse. It's a family resilience. And if the family is not in it together,
Yeah.
and if you have one person in that whole equation who's out of sync,
Yeah.
then it just messes up the entrepreneur's mindset.
Yeah.
Entrepreneur with a full 100% good mindset, healthy mindset,
Yeah.
is still difficult journey
Correct.
because
Yes.
you have to learn to do cash flows and selling and product development of product selling.
Yeah.
Everything is hiring, firing people, and it's a 24/7 job.
Yeah.
And then you're getting, a little bit of dissonance here.
Yeah.
And so therefore it's extremely difficult then. But if you have got the family together,
Yeah.
and fortunately my kids were not that old to realize what was going on. I mean, Freya did extremely well to jump out, took some, local school exams and PSLE and got into a good school and went through till Sec 2, I think. And then high school, we flipped her to American school again back.
Okay. Yeah. And I love that you brought this up because I think it's that the entire ecosystem, in a way, the family ecosystem needs to come together for this to play out. And whether it's from a mental health perspective or from just being able to do what you want to do as an entrepreneur, the entire family has to come together and make it happen. How do you see, and you've spoken about Mona even partaking in with Fund Frontier, how do you see her role in
Yeah.
this? Yeah.
So there are multiple things that I want to say. First is, if you are an entrepreneur and you're single, take a chance then, because at that time there is no encumbrance, right? You're really free to do what you want, how much time you want to spend and how much energy you want to spend. And if you don't have a paycheck one month, you're going to sleep on the floor and eat whatever you want.
Yeah.
Absolutely brilliant time.
Mm.
Unfortunately, many people have this uneasiness that I don't know what entrepreneurship is about and what I haven't learned enough. There are people who want to keep learning, saying, no, I want to learn a little bit more till I get there. You'll never get there. At some point, you got to just jump off the cliff and start being an entrepreneur. You get married and then you do it, and if your spouse is working and getting a paycheck, fantastic, right? Because now, at least you know that food is going to be there on the table, the rent is going to get paid. You have kids and now you are quitting a job, then I hope that you've saved enough money to be able to handle it for a little while, right? I think that's really the key piece, which is to say, can you turn down your lifestyle? And if the answer is no, right, in a place like Singapore, people want this high lifestyle,
Right.
and they say, I'm not willing to take that risk, then don't, then continue,
Yeah.
but then don't complain that you're not
Happy
getting the
to do it,
windfall of an entrepreneur, windfall in many ways, including money and the pride of
Yeah.
doing a startup.
So, how do you see that, having been on the other side where this worked for you all? How do you see her role, your kids' role in you being able to successfully do what you wanted to do?
Oh, I just allowing me to do what I wanted to do,
Yeah.
being patient with me and allowing me to do what I wanted to do,
Yeah.
especially when I flipped and did a couple of things right at the same time. It was not always pleasant. It was not always that we had enough money to do whatever we wanted to do.
Yeah.
And so it was a mutual sacrifice across the board that
Yes.
everybody was making, two of whom knew,
Yeah.
one of whom knew a lot more than the other person.
Yeah.
Thank God, because if the other person, if Mona had known all the things that we had to go through, and the kind of tensions and pressures we had to take, which you obviously absorb as much as possible. The less they know, the better, kind of a thing. But the kids, of course, were clueless about it. Kids are resilient. They don't
Yes,
care
they
about
can
these
adapt.
things, right?
Yeah.
As long as they've got friends and they go to school and they eat.
Yeah, yeah. So in that sense, was there, your role as a father, did you feel you were missing out? And I can imagine you have long hours and you're completely invested in during that time.
No, I think I spent good time with my kids. In a little doorway. We used to play cricket. I remember all of that. We used to go out and hang out with friends and things like that. So yeah, I mean, if I was working in a company where you're a senior executive,
Yes.
those are also 60-hour jobs. So it's not like it's just like you're going 8 to 5 and 5 o'clock you switch off, right? It doesn't work like that. So the better you do, the more money you make, the more pressures there are. So it's something you have to decide. Right? You want to be an executive and you stay at a middle level. I'm happy and content. I don't want to make more money. I'll spend more time with my family.
Right.
Or I'll continue to push upwards and I will go higher and higher.
Yeah.
And there are bankers here who may make 7-figure salaries.
Yeah.
But I know the pressures they go through and I know the
Mm.
amount of time, effort, energy they spend
Yeah.
to keep that job and to continue that job. It's very difficult. So are they 24/7 engaged in their work? Yes. Do they spend time with their family? Is it quality time that they spend with their family? I don't think it's any different than an entrepreneur and an executive from that point of view.
Got it. And I think this also comes down to awareness of what you need in your life. And I think we spoke about this the last time as well. A lot of people tend to get caught up in how people perceive them. And then that drives all the decisions, and that's where it can get confusing because you don't want to give up on the lifestyle because you don't want to be seen a certain way, yet you want the outcomes that one sees with startups and entrepreneurs and all of that.
Both Mona and I almost don't get caught up worrying about what people think about us. We do our thing, individually and collectively, right? I mean, that's a huge unfair advantage that we have.
Yeah.
Because when you get caught up and constantly you are doing things and measuring things and making decisions, that what will the ecosystem think? It's a huge challenge.
It is, yes. Jayesh, there's a lot of conversation around hustle and self-care. For an entrepreneurial life, how much are we glorifying in a way the kind of work that it requires, and how much should one, tune into their own self-care? And from a mental health perspective, from what you've been through, is there any advice or anything that you'd like to share with people going through this journey?
Yeah, I think the most important thing is, why are you becoming an entrepreneur? Why the hustle? Okay, if the hustle is because everybody is doing it, entrepreneurship, so let me do it. It'll look great because people will think that, wow, he's doing an entrepreneurship, he's becoming an entrepreneur. Or with a specific outcome in mind, that when I exit, I will look really good. You can't do a startup with an exit in mind. That doesn't work. If you want to hustle because you want to create, build, and distribute a useful product or service to the world, then that's a great idea. So either it's your own idea or it's your idea, and you have a product idea or a service idea that I like, and I want to participate along with you, and that usually is a very, very powerful measurement system to say that I have got an idea, and that idea is going to be extremely useful, a product or a service. Then hustle, because then you have a passion inside you that I think this is a terrific idea, and I want to sell my idea to investors, to employees, to directors, to my partners, to vendors, to customers. And then when you see that coming into fruition, there's a different type of high and a joy beside a bragging right, which if you wanted bragging rights, you'd get it, don't worry, just hold back a little bit, right, but you get it. But it's just self-care. Now, self-care is, I have my box, I have my comfort zone, I want to stay within that, and I just want to keep caring about my health and my mental wellness, right, and that's more important to me than this hustle of creating something useful, right. So, I mean, look, everybody does different types of things to make money, and is there a color to that making of money? I think there is, right? So one is the ethicalness of the making the money. Second is it a useful product or service? And are you creating something, right? Are you creating value? If you're creating value, then I become happy. But if you're doing something which doesn't really add value, but you're making money, it's fine. I mean, at the end of the day, it's still a business. So at the end of the day, I think the self-care part only comes to the point where if mentally you cannot handle it, then it's unnatural. So you have to understand your risk-taking ability. You have to understand and evaluate your personality to take that pressure. So if mentally you break, then at the end of the world, in a way. So mental wellness is extremely important, but you must have that resilience and the state of mind which is constantly striving and struggling to make that product or service distributed out there to people who then start using it, and you get a lot of joy from it and hopefully make economic substance out of it also.
So are you saying that it's either or, it's difficult to maintain that kind of balance, or is it and it could be, or I think there's also this other element that I heard when you were speaking about this, is that the joy that gives you, that pain in a way is not so painful for you anyway.
Yes, I don't think you constantly look at it as pain. Pain comes in bursts.
Yeah.
It is not there constantly.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
So what happens is that at the end of the month, when there is time for payroll, and if you don't have the money, that's painful.
Yeah.
But during the week, during the month, you're creating a product and it's not coming out as the way you want, and it's slightly painful, and you fix it and you work on it and you work hard and you push people and collect the energies for a certain outcome.
Yeah.
That's what you do.
Right.
But at the end of the day, if it becomes unbearable, then I think you're doing something wrong, right? So I think, so if you meditate, for example, that helps a lot. Takes off the pressure, gives you certain different type of attitude and skills, expands your mind and horizon and mental wellness to be able to absorb a lot more and not get ruffled that, oh my God, why is this happening to me?
Yeah. So using it perhaps as an enabler, not looking at it as I'm either taking care of myself or I'm hustling. I think integrating that kind of self-care, like you said, perhaps it could be a meditation practice that will enable and fuel only what you're doing and enable you to do it better in a way.
Absolutely.
Okay. In terms of mentorship, is there anything that you do, programs that you run? Where can people reach out to you?
Yeah.
So,
I used to mentor anyone and everyone all through the day. I went through that journey, and then I discovered something called time affluence, and so I have become fairly discriminating in that I choose and pick. However, anybody who comes to me, I will evaluate, I will give them time to figure out what is it that they need, and then pass them to younger people, smarter people, people who are now happening people, right? I do that. And I don't mentor anyone and everyone anymore. And part of the reason is because also, as the last time I mentioned to you, that I'm starting a venture capital fund on alternative protein startups. So you heard of Impossible Foods and Beyond Meat and all that. And there are many, many other companies, startups all over the world that are growing and doing extremely well. So I'm going to actually spend the next leg of my journey over the next 5-10 years doing this venture capital fund where I invest in alternative protein startups. And so in terms of mentoring, absolutely. I mean, if somebody has a specific challenge that I can help them with, most happy to help them. But in most cases, I think I can guide them to go to a certain person who would be more, who might have more time or more current dated in terms of technology or managerial skills.
Yeah. And in terms of the new venture capital fund that you mentioned, can startups reach out to you? How's that going to pan out?
Yes, again, as soon as we announce it, I mean, we are structuring the fund now. So first quarter of 2021, we hope to launch it. And then once we announce it, then of course you will see, enough information about it. But yes, absolutely. Alternative protein startups, fortunately, are not, the industry is not that massive still. It's still growing, but it's not like a tech industry, right? If somebody's doing a digital payment kind of a startup, the number of angel investors, the venture capital fund, the angel networks is huge, and the number of startups are huge. So it's a massively many-to-many connection. Whereas in our field now, we know all the startups in Singapore who, for example, are doing alternative startups. All the funds like ours will know that we are an alternative startup venture fund. So Good Protein Fund will certainly welcome
Awesome.
any and all startup entrepreneurs.
Awesome. Thank you. We'll end on that note and we'll be back again in conversation for more.
Look forward. Thank you so much.